today's episode, I will be discussing some effects of globalization and multiculturalism. Hello, I'm your host Sagarika and welcome to my channel, A Questioning Mind. A country that opens up its markets does open its mind in many ways. We can eat at McDonald's, drink at Irish pubs while discussing American politics and Spanish football. And yet, most of us remain Indian, worshipping different deities, speaking different regional languages once we go home. So are we really globalized? What does it even mean? What does it lead to? While the world has had open boundaries almost through all of history, the word globalization used in the current context was first coined in the 30s. It was popularized by a professor at Harvard Business School, Theodore Levitt, and it listed a few traits that marked globalization as it is used in today's language. Trade has always opened the doors to heightened interactions. After all, a good business person would have to understand the value of a large market, and thus they create various bases. To some extent, they integrate themselves within those bases, perhaps picking up bits of culture, the language, in order to relate to their customers. Within India, Marwadis as a community are especially well known for their business acumen, but also for their ability to work across regional and linguistic divides within the country. They can be found in the northeastern states, in the southern states, in the west, everywhere. The West is pretty much their home, but across the country, regardless of what the languages, local languages of the state are. Globalization, on the other hand, has to do with international borders, and it's meant an exchange of ideas and philosophies, culture and clothing across those borders, in addition to more than just transactions. Economic globalization helps bring goods and services across international borders and different cultural societies, forging relations. These relations are transactional, certainly. Still, they do provide a way to open up the experiences of the people participating in those transactions in order to find some sort of ground for commonality between those people and those places. This helps them better market themselves and their products and services. As you may remember, McDonald's had to bring in vegetarian burgers when they came into India, before which they had failed trying to sell the usual non-vegetarian products that they do abroad. From a consumer standpoint, it certainly helps to have more choice, and the increased competition offers the possibility of lowered prices, unless there's an oligarchy or cartelization or something like that, which is less than usual. Across the world, freer markets have encouraged better infrastructure, benefiting the local populations. Freer markets internationally allow countries with saturated markets to expand into newer markets. Economic globalization also helps recipient countries get resources or goods, services that would simply be unavailable. This can be applied to essentials such as oil and minerals, but also to KFCs. Economic globalization is only one aspect of globalization as a whole, though. Economic globalization caused slow familiarity with cultures and cuisines across the world. It's created some sort of curiosity about people on the other side of the border. And education is also an aspect of globalization. It was deemed to be superior in European nations and the US. And for people all over the world, including India, they've flocked to those nations. And education and economics were powerful, but they were not the sole means of bringing about a more varied society. As wars raged across the world, countries ravaged by such devastation tried hard to escape to the developed world. While illegal immigration for economic opportunities was an older phenomenon, rapid one-directional flow of immigrants to several countries as war and economic refugees speeded up cultural exchange, creating multicultural societies. These were relatively unplanned for, and assimilation into recipient countries is low, since that would be stepping into cultural nullification of a people that have already lost their loved ones and their livelihoods, among other things. However, without a means of assimilation and without planning for overflow of culturally disparate people, the recipient countries have been caught on the back foot. This is visible across the world. And multiculturalism is one of the many effects of globalization. If it were dependent on a carefully constructed process of vetting a certain number of people across borders, there may have been a truer exchange of culture. As it stands now, though, most cultures outside of their states of indigenousness tend to aggregate into ghettos to preserve the ways of lives that they are familiar with. So multiculturalism has become an appropriation of some aspects of various cultures while not acknowledging other areas. For example, you might be familiar with Asian Oriental cuisine across the world. The British have a lot of Indian curry. However, they would ignore certain other aspects, such as the different cultures, the different languages, and would simply be unaware of the significance of something like polytheism when they are part of, when they are living in the UK. So, in a country where, I'm still talking about the UK, but in a country where honor-based offenses have soared by 81% in the last 5 years, and sex grooming gangs are able to flourish, the police do not want to be labeled racist and fear to tread upon the ways of lives of immigrant populations. This leaves the vulnerable, very often the women, the children in their country without a road to justice in case perpetrators belong to certain communities, especially to the migrant communities. Now, I mean, it's all good to appreciate curry and cuisine, but it's also necessary to understand the status of citizenry and to have clear direction as to the law and order systems that anybody within a bounded, bordered nation state needs, right? A second effect that is being recognized as an effect of globalization is hegemonic imposition. As English is a common language on the global stage, the possibility of a unipolar cultural hegemon in the form of the US has been recognized. The economic input of the US into media, culture, consumption has been widely responsible for shaping the way many people across the world approach their own world. Bobby Banerjee and Stephen Linstead of London University and of the University of York have gone so far as to call it a fiction to enable colonialism. And I have links to that paper in the description box below. While I do have disagreement with the paper, the fact is that a sort of coarse multiculturalism has damaged existing systems of local economies, family, and community without functional replacements for them. This creates scope for rapid disruption in society and affects stability. Semi-regulated population flow into a country causes ethno-racial tensions, and it's apparent across the world. Norway, Austria, Belgium have seen examples of riots and increased instability in recent times. To be fair, though, the flux is completely in keeping with movement throughout all of history. It's not a recent phenomenon, although due to the prevalence of media and due to the prevalence of news, we are witnessing more of it, and it's coming into the common person's bedrooms and living rooms, but it's something that's always happened, although to a lesser extent. Technological development may have hastened the movement. Current world systems have made migrations less intentional rather than outright warring, colonization, economic exploitation. But its effects, due to the current coverage, constant being in the eye, have tended to become more insidious. Multiculturalism as a societal imposition is also heightened after devastating wars, while trying to alleviate the suffering of as many as possible is cited as national duty for some countries. When you have immigrants from Syria trying to come into German borders, it is the will of the citizenry to allow these refugees into their nation to help the pain and the lost, which is completely humane. But to consider that only economic globalization is true globalization and that it causes people to assimilate more easily into recipient societies realize that economics is hardly the only factor in the creation of any multicultural society today. The societal disruption that the idea of a global village has caused is exposed by the sheer cognitive dissonance when the expectation of a better life in different nations is often believed to be a lie. And when common citizens of recipient nations attempt to rationalize away the differences in lives and lifestyles, they're faced with completely unexpected confrontation with people other than who they're familiar with. For example, what I'm trying to say is basically this goes both ways. For those coming in, it's very difficult for them to understand, the expectation of living in some country like the US is very different from the reality of living in a country like the US. This is common for all migrant populations, whether legal or illegal. Obviously, legal citizens have better opportunities. However, the whole dream is sometimes shattered for those people who come in, discover a different way of living, live in refugee camps for years on end, witness parents and cousins and relatives working really hard only to then be threatened with deportation for the rest of their lives. On the other hand, the receiving nations, populations of receiving nations, they tend to have to rationalize away the differences when they see that people behave in a manner in terms of their lifestyle that is completely incoherent with what they are used to. For example, the status of women is often different from immigrant populations. Let's not use euphemisms, it's often lower for people coming from religiously conservative nations such as Syria or Iran. And so the recipient countries, in order to be respectful to the migrant populations, do rationalize away their differences, and it does affect their way of thinking and living to a certain extent. So I do believe that assimilation is completely normal, and it's easier for certain populations as compared to other populations. But if it is never enforced today due to reasoning and rationalization, that tends to be less than logical in some instances and definitely less than legal in many others. So logically, this should broaden minds to be more very different perspectives. But what globalization has done is forced a myth of stable, almost homogenized society, just enough variety to keep things interesting for nations that are essentially comprised of ghettoized populations looking out for their own interests. It's not as if people mix and really open up their minds as globalization would, as the myth of globalization would have you believe. It just creates multicultural societies where there are ghettos of different populations. And essentially, the hype around globalization was the hype around a failed experiment. Unless the world achieves a very stable state of peace with stagnant and highly equal societies, people will be unable to make the choice of exploring the world on their own and settling in different parts of the world without shared agenda. Multiculturalism is not necessarily a virtue. Globalization has not brought forth the massive gains that it promised equally to participating peoples. The internet has certainly made the world smaller, as has economics and the rest of technology. However, as long as these are not the only forces driving migration, the acceptance of diversity will have to be enforced, exposing again the lie of a successfully globalized world. I'll leave your thoughts down below in the comment section below. Reach out on my Twitter, and I would love to engage with you on what you think. Do find additional reading linked in the description box below, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you for joining me today.